Hubbard clauses don't typically kill real estate closings. It's the misunderstanding that surrounds them that does. If you're buying a home in the state of Connecticut and you need to sell your home in order to close, this video is directly for you. If you don't understand how a Hubbard clause works, you could be losing the house you want, or even worse, think you're under contract when you're really not. Hi, I'm attorney Kishore Kapoor, a residential real estate closing attorney here in the state of Connecticut. Every day, we share real life stories from real closings so you can learn from my clients' experiences and hopefully have a smooth and stress free closing. So, today I'm going to tell you two stories, and they're a little bit different. So, one is we represented a buyer. They had found their dream home. Everything was perfect. There was only one slight issue. They needed to sell their home in order to buy the next home. Luckily for them, they had hired a realtor that understood the Hubbard clause and was able to wrap us in so we can explain it to the client so that everybody felt comfortable. A Hubbard clause allows you to sell your home before you purchase the next one. And it makes it so that the purchase is protected if in the event that you can't sell. Now, the nuances of it vary Hubbard clause to Hubbard clause. So I'm going to tell you the one that we use standard in Connecticut outside of Fairfield County is that the buyer makes an offer contingent upon them selling their current home. However, the seller is still able to market, list, and show that property until a certain date. The buyer still can continue to work, close on their property, and then still will be able to buy if all this is in the date that you select in the contract. Now, what happens if the buyer has a deal fall apart? Well, the buyer is protected so they don't have to close, right? That's number one. If the seller finds another offer that comes in that's higher, in the contract, we're going to write a time frame that the buyer has to agree to change their mind and remove the contingency. Typically, it's 48 to 72 hours. And at that point, they can close without the Hubbard clause. So if their purchase falls apart on the sale side, they are stuck still buying it or losing their deposit. But this is a great option, especially in today's market where it's very much a seller's market. It is a great option because it allows the buyer to put an offer in and continue to sell their property and make it all work. It also does benefit a seller. Most people don't realize that the seller still has the option to list and show the property so that they could get in another offer. The buyer's offer is their base. They could accept anything higher and make it contingent upon their current buyer releasing their contract. Sometimes that happens. We had a situation where our client had found their dream house, but their property wasn't selling. The seller came along and said, listen, we got another offer. The offer is higher. We would like to take it. Do you want to close at your price, or will you release the contract and move forward? Ultimately, my buyer did not feel comfortable putting their deposit at risk. They released their contract, and the seller sold to somebody else. Now, that's not a happy story, but for our client, it was the best situation because we didn't know when their property would sell or if it would sell, and they didn't want to put their deposit at risk. So it is a really smart option for both the buyer and the seller. Now, let's tell a story of the flip side. We had a client buying a house. They did not want to put a Hubbard into it. They didn't want to tell the sellers that they were selling their property because they were worried that they made their offer weaker. Well, we went through the process. The mortgage got approved. Title came back good. There were a few inspection issues, but we worked through them. Everything was moving along smoothly. The buyer's buyer already had a contract in place. We were moving along. It was about a week before we closed, and the buyer's mortgage fell apart. Now, the problem for our client was they could not afford both houses. And they didn't plan well because their buyer only put down $1,000 deposit and they put down a $10,000 deposit. Unfortunately, they got to keep the $1,000, but they lost $10,000. So they ended up losing $9,000 because they did not put in a Hubbard clause to protect themselves. Now, their understanding or their belief was accurate. It probably would have been harder for a buyer to get an offer accepted with a Hubbard clause. It does not mean it does not happen. So this is something that's extremely important to understand. What are your rights? What protects you? What can you do? If you are thinking about buying a home and selling one at the same time, or you're considering on taking an offer with a Hubbard in it, give us a call before you sign. Let somebody in my office explain to you what a Hubbard clause means and does not mean, because every one of them is just slightly different, right? And that few minutes could save you between closing on your dream home or not. It also could mean that you lose your closing or we close. Um, so like I said earlier, there's a few lessons. Well, there are a few lessons you need to learn here. There are actually 5 lessons. One is a history lesson, but I'm gonna get there. Well, I'm actually gonna start with the history lesson first. So people wonder, where did the word Hubbard clause come from? It's something as an attorney, when I got started, I was interested too. So it's actually a straightforward and simple answer. Years and years ago, there was an important court case involving a guy named Hubbard. Hubbard had set up a contract with this type of provision. It became a fight. It went to court. The judges ruled in favor of Hubbard, saying that he had the right to do this. And ever since then, real estate professionals everywhere have been using something called the Hubbard clause without knowing why it was called the Hubbard clause. Now you know. But the important part is what it allows you to do. It allows you to sell your house and buy another house without requiring you putting your deposit at risk, because if your sale falls apart, you could still walk away from the purchase. Or you could continue with the purchase, whatever you decide to do. So it protects the buyer is lesson number 2. It protects the buyer, allows the buyer to walk away in a situation where they can't sell their house or they're closing with their property falls. Also, it is a seller accepting a risk, understanding that there are contingencies in place that could push their closing back even farther than they planned. So it makes it harder for them to plan, but it also gives them the ability to remarket their property and potentially get a higher offer and request to have the Hubbard removed, right? So it does have a perk and a negative. And then the last and final and probably the most important part is you need to read the Hubbard clause, because small words in the Hubbard clause can make a huge difference. So I talked about Fairfield County. In Fairfield County, there are attorneys that will draft a Hubbard clause that will allow a seller to continue to market the property. And if they get another offer that is higher, the buyer needs to increase the purchase price to match that same deal if they want to keep the property. So reading your Hubbard clause is extremely important. More important is, if you don't understand it, you can't ask your real estate agent because it's legal advice. You need to call an attorney. And we're here to help you with that. If you have a Hubbard clause and you have questions about it, feel free to give us a call. So Hubbard clauses are extremely useful, but you need to understand how they work. Now, if you found this information helpful, or you just like listening to me talk, either one's fine, be sure to give us a follow, because we post stories like this every day, and we don't want you to end up to be one of our stories. We share real life situations from real life closings, so you can hopefully have a stress-free and smooth closing. And if you'd like to learn more about the closing process, watch these videos.